If I told you there was a simple way to catch more fish on a fly rod, would you listen? Now, what if I told you that part of this method involves revisiting some of your most painful angling memories? Oh! There we go. Oh! Yeah. Oh! Oh, that was a big one. Because as painful as it is to lose a nice trout, there is a ton you can learn from those moments. The key is knowing what to look for so you learn the right lessons. On today's show, I'm going to walk you through the most common reasons that fly anglers lose fish and how you can avoid making those same mistakes. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. You know, losing big fish, losing any fish really, but big fish in particular, it cuts me real deep. That's, if I had to rank my least favorite moments in life, losing big fish is right behind when somebody writes into the show just to tell me that they think Diet Pepsi is better than Diet Coke. That cuts me real deep. That gets me right where it counts. But while I can't fix their taste buds, unfortunately, what I hope to do today for all of us is to help us learn how we can reduce the amount of times we lose not just any fish, but especially the big ones. Because if you pay attention when you're hooked up into a fish, you can learn a lot from those ones that you actually lose, right? It might sound a little counterintuitive, but there's a lot to learn in those instances, and hopefully, by doing that, you're going to reduce the amount of time that you spend stranded streamside weeping uncontrollably over yet another big one that got away. We all have those stories, and while they're fun to tell every now and then, they're not all that fun to go through. But what exactly do you need to pay attention to? Right? I mentioned that. You got to pay attention. Well, what do you got to pay attention to? As a new angler, whenever it was, I honestly don't know how long ago it's been. I'm kind of in denial. I just had a recent birthday thing, and I'm kind of in denial of getting old, and there's gray hair coming in, and I'm starting to think about life insurance and all this crap. Anyways, and my back hurts, but that's because I'm fat. Anyways, I know that when I started out as a new angler, however long ago it was, when I lost big fish, I never understood why. I assumed it was something that I did wrong. I blamed the fish plenty too, but I never knew exactly what it was that I did wrong that caused that fish to scamper, to spit the fly and get out of here. And that's really how I arrived at the idea for this podcast. We've had a few questions lately from listeners who wrote in wanting to know, tips for landing fish, or how do I fight fish better? We get that question fairly often here, so I really wanted to dive into it and take a look at it. What I ended up doing is putting together a checklist of sorts that you can use after you lose a fish. It doesn't have to be a big one. Any of them will do, but usually it's the big ones that stick out. We all remember that. And this checklist is going to help you know exactly what to look for so that you can diagnose what went wrong. You're going to have to be honest with yourself, which if you're anything like me, isn't always that fun. But if you are honest with yourself, you're going to get a much clearer picture of what exactly went wrong while you were fighting that big fish, and to prevent that from happening in the future. But before we get into that, before we dive into our checklist here, I just want to make it extremely clear that I am by no means some epic fish wrangling guru who never loses a fish or never makes mistakes. That's just not true at all. I mean, shoot, I was out fishing yesterday, and I didn't catch a single fish all daggum day. Now, part of that was water conditions and whatnot, and I'm not making excuses, but, I can go out and not catch fish, and shoot, I can even think of 3 off the top of my head right now, 3 moments just over the last month where fish have completely taken me to school and shown me who's boss, and I've been standing there with a rod and limp line on the bank just wondering, all right, well, what happened there? And I was going through this process. One of those really big ones actually was the genesis for this show. I was like, man, I got to do a podcast about this. Oh, but I would like to think, though, that at this point in my fly fishing career, I do land a few more of the bigger fish, and I think that's because I've I've had some incredible mentors who walked me through this, and they're like, dude, you lost that fish because you're being an idiot, and here's why. They tell me. Uh, so I want to give that same advice to everybody except sans the idiot part. I don't know if that helped. Um, while I don't know if it's true, though, that I actually do land more fish now, I can tell you something I couldn't have told you a long time ago. And that's exactly why I lost those fish. Those 3 fish that I just mentioned that took me to school, I can tell you exactly why I lost them. It may not have been immediately apparent right after I lost them, but looking at it, looking back at the fight, I was like, yeah, this is what I did wrong. I messed that up. Boom. The version of me who started fly fishing all those years ago never would have been able to answer that question. So that's where I hope to get us all to by the end of this show. But with that out of the way, let's dive into. I've identified the 5 most common problems that cause us fly anglers to lose fish. So number one issue, and these aren't in any order, although I do think this one is number one. If I had to pick one that was most important out of all of them, it would be this one, and that is tension on the line. There's an old Chris Ledoux song called Silence on the Line, and that is the exact opposite of what you want. You want your fly line and leader to stay under constant tension throughout the entire fight with a fish, and that just means that the line stays nice and tight. When we talk about keeping your line under tension, it means it's tight, it's tightly connected to the fish, there's not slack in it. Think about how tight the line is when you initially set the hook into a fish. Pretty tight, right? That's how tight your line should stay throughout the entire fight. That is arguably the main reason behind anglers being told to keep the tip up when they hook into a fish. If you've ever been out with somebody who taught you fishing, maybe even a guide, guides might say it sometimes, you hook into something, keep tip up. And we're telling you to do that, not because it's so important to keep the tip super high in the air, but it works as a good reminder to keep tension on the line constantly throughout the fight. If the tip's up, chances are there's going to be tension on the line, because the second that you lose that tension, your chances for losing the fish increase exponentially, just like my waistline after Alex takes me to all-you-can-eat wings. Now, we've actually gone over this concept, the tension on the line, not the waistline and wings thing. That would be really awkward. We've covered this concept in our beginner fly fishing masterclass. I'll drop a link to it in the show notes so you can actually see line tension play out in real life, not just hear about it. It's probably helpful. But I do want to drive home the point that keeping the tip up isn't the only way to keep tension on your line through the entire fight. One of the best ways to effectively get fish into the net is to use side pressure. So that's when, instead of keeping that rod sky high, you turn your rod to the side. You might see this in some YouTube videos. It's very prominent when you watch Euro nymphing videos. A lot of those Euro nymph anglers are very good. They hook into a fish and boom, immediately put side pressure on the fish to get it into the net. The reason they do that is by turning your rod to the side, it allows you to use the entire length of the rod to put pressure on the fish. When you're just keeping the tip straight up in the air, the only part of the rod that's exerting any pressure on the fish is the tip, which is the weakest, least strong part of the entire rod. You turn your rod to the side, all of a sudden you've got that big, beefy butt section that you can use to really put the hurt on a fish and pull them out of the current into the net, right? What I like to do is I turn the rod in the opposite direction that the fish is moving. So if the fish is running upstream, I will apply side pressure so that the big bend of my rod is facing downstream. And that does a couple of things. Keeps tension on the line, keeps the hook in there nice and tight, and lets me use that entire length of the rod to put pressure on the fish, pull it out of the current, get it into the net, get it back into the water as quick as I can. So however you do it, no matter how you accomplish it, you've got to keep tension on the line. That is, like I said, that's probably the most important thing. I listed it first because I think it is most important, even if the rest of these aren't necessarily in order. Now, coming up next, and this is a very big contender for number one, and that would be tip number 2, which is knots, right? So tell you all a little story about this for a second. I was out on the water last week and I hooked into a nice fish. It was big. I'll just go right at that. It was big. It was beautiful. Okay. I haven't seen a fish like this in a long time. And it was a big brown. And I know it was a brown. And I know that it was big and beautiful because it jumped a couple of times after it ate my fly. And it like tail walked out of the water. It was doing those things that makes your heart stop. You look at the fish like, oh, that's a big one. And I had that moment and I was all by myself. My off-camera net man wasn't there. Alex was still in Utah. There's nobody within sight. And I'm like, oh, I'm all on my own. There's no cameras, nothing. How am I going to do this? And I ended up losing the fish because the fish, right after eating my fly, it runs downstream. So I'm trying to follow it. I'm trying not to trip over rocks, try not to hurt myself. And the fish moves into some slack water behind a nice big boulder. And I get about level with it. I'm reeling in a bit of line, and the fish immediately turns out of the pocket into the current, and boom, just like that, my line goes limp. Everything gets quiet, starts to get dark. I question the meaning of life. I wonder if it's even worth fishing anymore. Should I just sell all my stuff and be done? If I can't even land this fish, then dadgummit, what am I doing out here? Had a bit of an existential crisis. I yelled a little bit. Okay, I yelled a lot. And finally, when I was done feeling sorry for myself, I looked at what was left of my dry dropper rig. That's what I was fishing. The fish took the nymph, and I looked at the piece of tippet connecting the nymph to my dry fly, and it was fine, except for the end of it. The line was all curled and kinked up, and that is a telltale sign that my knot had failed. When you see those curly little ends on the line, it's usually a very good indication that you're not failed. If a fish just snaps the leader or the tippet somewhere in the middle of it, it's usually a pretty clean break. Those curlies mean that your knot was not good. The pressure of that bigger fish and the heavy current caused my knot to pull free. I hadn't messed up the fight. I didn't do anything wrong there. I just tied a bad knot. If you only take a few turns when you're tying your clinch knot, because that's what most of us use, then this is very likely going to happen. It's going to pull loose, and that's exactly what happened to me. So the lesson here is that your knots matter so much. They matter a ton. Do not rush through tying them. Don't shortchange how many times you wrap the tag end around the line and pull it through the loop for your clinch knot. I was always taught to do it at least 7 times. I think that's what's in our rigs and knots video. We've got an entire video on knots. I'll link that in the show notes as well, so you can take a look at it. It's really good to have a good visual representation for tying knots. But I can't stress this part enough. Take the time to put your rig together correctly. You're going to greatly reduce the chances of your knots giving out on you if you do that. So make sure that you tie your knots well, you seat them well, you don't skimp out on it. I always go at least 7 times. I usually probably do 10. I think if I'm actually counting and keeping track, I usually do at least 10. So your knots matter. You don't want to lose big fish. You don't want to have that existential crisis in the middle of the river like I did and consider selling everything and being done because you're so depressed that you lost a fish. You don't want that to happen. All right. The third thing that causes us fly anglers to lose fish, it's a combination of two. I lumped them together here. It's drag and line management. I put them together because they both deal with your reel. So I'm going to start off talking about the drag. If the drag on your reel, if you have that set too tight, there's a decent chance the fish is actually going to end up breaking your tippet or your leader. I want you to think for a minute to understand this concept. I want you to think how your leader, your rod, and your reel work together to handle a trout. When you're fighting a fish, the shock or the energy from that fish transfers down your leader and into the fly rod. The leader doesn't break because it's both strong and because the fly rod provides a place for all that excess energy to go. The fish is also able to pull against the resistance of the reel, but if that resistance is too much, the energy from that trout can be too much for your leader and tippet, which is going to cause it to break. Ideally, your drag should be tight enough that the fish has to work to pull line off the reel, but not so tight that a trout can't move at all. One of those 3 fish that I lost, was a direct result of me cranking my drag down just way too tight. I'd hooked into it, and it made a really big initial run. So I cranked the drag down, reeled it back in. I got it closer to the bank. I was getting ready to net it, and it tried to go and make another run, and it couldn't move. It just shook its head, and I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point, but it just shook its head, went boom, 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 and then the line just snapped, just like that. It was very frustrating, but it's because I tightened the drag too much. The fish just couldn't move. Now, in that same vein, it's not always going to be the drag that's too tight that prevents a fish from pulling your line. That is an issue, right? You do need to have the drag. Generally, I like it so that I have to apply a fair amount of pressure. But if you're really having to like pull on that, or you can barely even get it to move off the reel, that means it's too tight, because the fish is going to hit that, and there's going to be a sharp, almost jerk when the fish hits that brick wall of the drag. And if you're not using thick enough tippet, it can snap. And we're usually using like 4 and 5X for trout fishing. So it's just asking for stuff to snap at that point. Now, again, it's not just the reel and the too tight a drag that can cause that, because I want you to think we talked about fly line for a minute, right? Fly line has a knack for getting tangled around everything, including your fly rod, your reel, your fishing pack, every single branch or rock around your feet. It's going to find it. It's going to tangle around it. That's what fly line does. Something that I've seen happen, it's happened to me a couple of times this year. If your fly line wraps around the base of your reel seat, for example, and you don't notice that it's wrapped around there, then the shock of the fish running and then stopping hard against that tangled line will snap your leader. Your fly line can also tangle around itself on the spool, and I've had this happen before. I think it was just last week, I noticed that my line was tangled around itself on the spool, and I couldn't pull more line off the reel. That happens, I wouldn't say it's super common, but it happens usually when I'm reeling in fast. I'm not taking time to just put the line back on the reel correctly. But if that happens, it's going to get bound up, and it's not going to come off the reel smoothly, and it's going to act like that giant break and snap the leader, right? It's incredibly frustrating because it's something that is easily preventable, but we don't always easily prevent it because we're in a hurry for some reason. I do see the fly line tangling around things most often during the casting process, where usually it happens because anglers have too much line out, and then when they go to make their final shooting cast to lay all that fly line down, all the excess line in their line hand whips up and around the rod, and then they don't really notice it. So the best way to avoid this is try to only strip off the line that you actually need for that cast you're making, and then keep the amount of slack line out that you have at a minimum. That way it's not going to tangle as much. So there's that one. Let's talk about number 4. Okay, letting the fish run too much. So a lot of the fun of fly fishing comes from actually fighting the trout once you hook up. I think we'd all agree that's part of why we love this so much. But I think newer anglers, I certainly did when I was new, we have a tendency to prolong the fight a bit. It's fun, right? We want to feel the fight, but it's really not great for the fish from an ethical point of view. We want to land the fish as quickly as possible, get it back in the water as quickly as possible. We want to take care of the fish as much as we can. But not only is prolonging the fight not ethical, it's not great for catching fish either, because if you let the fish run too much and that fish pulls too much line off the reel, then you dramatically increase the opportunity to introduce slack into the line, and you're going to lose the fish. It's almost always you're going to lose the fish if you let them run way too much. I was on the green in Utah a good while ago, and I hooked into a nice fish right at the top of a set of rapids, and it turned and ran down through all the rapids, and I just let it run. I didn't try to like muscle it over into some of the calmer water. I just sat there and held on to it, grinning like an idiot, like, yeah, I'm having fun. And then my backing knot came out because it hit the rapids. It just went. And I was like, oh, this trout took me to backing. Well, A, my drag was super loose. B, I just let the fish do whatever it wanted. And C, I just let it run downstream on me 100-something feet. And my buddy that was with me just looks at me and he just face palms. It's like, you idiot, come on. And he explained to me very kindly, a lot more kinder than I deserved, I'll tell you that much. Explained to me, hey, When you do that, when you let the fish just run and run and run, you got all that line out there, how are you going to keep that line tight, right? Especially with all the pressure of rapids. You're not going to keep that line tight. So that's one example. Another example, if you let the fish run too much, right? If you let them, even if they don't take all the line off your reel, if you let them run too much, you're going to quickly learn how great trout are. They are amazing at this. They have PhDs. Every one of them has a PhD in this, at finding every rock, every branch, every snag to get your line tangled in, and you will lose it. About a month ago, me and Alex were out fishing together, and he hooks into this fish. And I've never seen Alex this excited about a fish. I've seen Alex excited about fish, but never like this. I mean, Alex is a pretty even-keeled guy. Never too high, never too low. He's just right there in the middle. It's a good place to be, and I admire the heck out of that part of him. But he was jumping out of his waders, excited at this fish, and he's hollering. He's get the net, get the net, get the. And so I'm hauling butt to get over to help Alex, and I just see this fish just start zooming, and this thing just took off. We were in this big pool, and this thing just took off to the other side of the pool, and I could see Alex's line just getting longer and longer and longer. Then I saw it stop, and I was like, oh no. My heart kind of stopped at that moment, because I knew what was happening, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to jinx it. What had happened is that fish just ran and ran and ran on Alex, and it dived right into this giant pile of moss. We could see the giant pile of moss. Fish was gone. It hit the moss. The hook popped out. It was done for. And I'm not like throwing Alex under the bus. Like, see, he made a mistake. He ruined this. The fish, Alex, I didn't get to take a look at it. He just saw it himself. He said it was huge. He said it was one of the biggest trout he's ever hooked into. And he's not prone to exaggeration like a lot of us fly anglers. He shoots it pretty straight. So I believe him. It was a big fish. And it's hard when those really big fish want to run. There's not always a ton that you can do. But at the same time, when that fish was running, I also watched Alex, and he was just kind of a little paralyzed a little bit, because it was a big fish, right? Something like that runs on you, you almost don't know what to do. And it's very hard to remember, oh yeah, side pressure, come on. Because you almost don't want to move, because you're so nervous that you're going to mess something up, that you feel like if you move, you're going to make it worse, when in reality, you've got to move. You've got to make some changes. You've got to actively fight the fish. You can't just let them school you. You can't just let them dictate the terms of the fight. It has to be on your terms. And part of that is not letting the fish run around too much, right? When I'm fighting fish, I'm almost always stripping or reeling in line through the entire fight, okay? If the fish isn't running, if it's not moving, you should be bringing line in somehow. That's going to reduce the amount that the fish can actually run, because they got to pull more and more line off. And then, you know, if you hook it 10 feet away, you get 5 feet of line in, it runs another 10 feet, it's still only 15 feet away instead of 30 at that point, or 25 or whatever it is. I taught English in high school. I didn't teach math, right? Don't come to me for math advice. But the point is, you cannot let the fish just dictate every aspect of the fight. And with that, we have arrived at the final tip. And this one's a little bit more out there, but I want you to bear with me while I try to explain it. This is, I see a lot of folks losing fish because they have the wrong angle on the fish when they're fighting. The angle that you get on a fish is hugely important. I don't think I can overstate it enough. Let me give you an example, though. It was end of May. Me and Alex were out on the water together. We've been out a lot this year. It's been really good. The fishing's been fantastic. And we both hooked into a couple of nice fish on this day. I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but neither of us landed in those big fish that we hooked into, because we both made the same mistake. It was actually kind of comical. After I lost mine, I looked at Alex. I was like, dude, we both did the same thing. We both screwed up the same way. What happened is we let the fish get almost directly downstream of us. So we hooked it, and it turned and ran downstream, and we just stood there. We didn't move. We didn't do as much as we could have to try and get them into calmer water so we could get a better angle on it. And when a fish gets into a position like that, when they're almost directly downstream of you, it's hard to get a good angle where you can apply pressure on the trout to get it into the net. And at that angle, when they're directly downstream of you, I feel like it's a lot easier for slack to get introduced into your fly line, which, as we know, is going to be the death knell for landing any fish. I personally have experienced when I let fish get downstream of me, I feel like I lose probably 80 to 90% of those fish that get significantly downstream of me. So the best way to combat this is ideally you're going to move so that you're either downstream or at the very least parallel to the fish. That's going to give you a better angle to put pressure on the fish, and the hook is less likely to work itself free at that point. When you're working to get that right angle, though, when you're trying to move or whatever, just make sure that you don't ever point your rod like directly at the fish. That's a recipe for instant slack, and you're going to lose a lot of fish that way. So hopefully, the next time you lose a big fish, you can go over this checklist and you can see where the problem was. In my opinion, I think what trips up a lot of beginners is a combination of not enough tension on the line and then having the wrong angle on a fish. When was it? Probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer. I did a guide trip on the Weber River in Utah once with a guy he was on a second cast of the day, like literal second cast of the day. He looked into maybe the biggest brown I've ever seen in the Weber River, and there's some nice fish in there. And that fish just took off upstream, but my client pointed the rod straight at the fish and let his line go slack. So next thing you know, boom, fish had popped the fly free, and we're both standing there really upset about it. But he was new to the game. That sort of thing happens. But that's just one example of many that I've seen where not enough tension and having the wrong angle on the fish is going to cost you in the long run. So pay attention to your angles, pay attention to your tension, and I think you're going to find you're going to end up putting quite a few more fish in the net. And with that, folks, get ready because next up, we have the Q&A section for this week's show.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly, no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Hudson from Utah is going to lead us off in the Q&A section for this week. He wrote in and said, "Hey, Spencer, Diet Coke is way better than Diet Pepsi." You're dadgum right it is, Hudson. Me and my dad have been listening to this podcast since day one, and we love it. It helps me with my problems on the river. Now to my question, when I'm out in deeper parts of the river, how do I know when I'm getting hung up on the rocks or if I'm being a horrible fisherman and missing fish all the time? Thanks for everything and tight lines. Well, Hudson, thanks a bunch. I'm really glad to hear from an OG Untangled groupie. Thanks for bearing with me through all the steep, very, very, very steep learning curves of podcasting. You're asking a great question here, though. The big picture, I will tell you that over time, the more and more you fly fish, you are going to gain almost a sixth sense. It's probably the best way to describe it for what is or isn't a bite when you're drifting your flies through, especially when you're drifting nymphs. But that sixth sense, I should have picked a different phrase because I apparently can't say it. That sixth sense ain't always foolproof. So, smaller picture, let's dive into it a little bit. Let's review what we already know about drifting nymphs, which that's what I assume you're talking about here, just based on the nature of your question. So we know that when we're fishing a nymph rig, right, we want to get our nymphs, our flies into the strike zone. And we know that the strike zone is just that area of the water column where trout are most likely feeding on nymphs. And most of the time, that's going to be near the bottom of the river because that's where the current is moving the slowest. And there's an abundance of food down there. So it's easy living for trout. So they hang out there, they get fat and happy and laugh at all the bad drifts that we throw in front of them. Now, if your flies are in that strike zone, then there's a very high likelihood that you're getting caught up on the bottom. That's actually a sign that your flies are exactly where they need to be. That's one of the ways that you know you're in the strike zone, because you are getting hung up every couple of casts, maybe. You're at least snagging the bottom frequently enough to let you know that, yes, you actually are down deep enough. But if you're hanging up every single time that you cast, then you're probably a little bit too deep. Ideally, For me, if I'm catching bottom every like 4 or 5 casts, maybe at a maximum, that lets me know that I'm as deep as I need to be. So we know we've got to be deep. How do we tell then if we're just hitting bottom or if trout are taking our flies? Well, pretty simple. You got to set the hook, man. Hook sets are free. You'll never develop that feel for what is and isn't a fish if you don't set the hook on everything. You got to set the hook. Otherwise, you're never going to learn. So anytime your indicator moves in a way that's not natural or it stops moving at all, that counts as not natural, then set the hook. Over time, you're going to gain that sixth sense. Hey, I said it that time that I mentioned at the start of this question. Now, there is a little bit of a hot take. Alex chimed in here on this particular question. We review a lot of our work that we do together, and he was looking at the script for this week's show, and he's like, oh, we got to say this. And he chimed in a little bit and said, for a beginner, yes, you should set the hook. But Alex makes a very good point that depending on the stream size that you're on and the water conditions, sometimes setting the hook can spook fish. So Alex is a little bit more wary in situations like that. An example he gave was on one of our favorite spring creeks. There's times when he doesn't set the hook because the flies are drifting right by another fish, and that really fast motion can make those fish scamper. So sometimes you don't want to always set the hook, but I would say for beginners, the best way to learn quickly what is and isn't a fish is setting the hook. So make sure you're doing that, and I think the more and more you do that, more and more you try, Hudson, the better off you're going to be. Garrett from Nova Scotia has our next question, writes in and says, hey, Spencer, just started listening to your podcast and enjoy taking in all the new information I've been learning. I'm relatively new to fly fishing and spend all my time fishing brooks and small rivers where I'm usually casting upstream and letting my flies drift downstream. My question is, how do I fly fish a small lake or still water where there's no current to drift my flies? Is there a specific method or do I just allow my flies to just sink and slowly retrieve? Thanks for the time and all the great content. Garrett, great to have you in the Untangled community. Thanks for joining, man. This is a good question. We've covered it a few times here at Untangled. I'll link one of our podcast episodes about fly fishing in lakes in the show notes so you can have an in-depth look at it there. But to broadly answer your question, lakes are tough, in my opinion. I think they're tougher than rivers because all the water features that we've learned to recognize in a river, they just don't exist in lakes. So it's tougher to figure out where the fish are going to be hanging out. Give you an example. Yesterday, I was out exploring some water here in Wyoming, and there were a couple little ponds I was interested in. So I loaded up and got up to there and walked into them. And the wind was blowing, not just a regular Wyoming wind. This was like a hurricane. I don't know what was blowing in, but it was fierce. Almost blew my hat off. And that would have been a catastrophe if that had happened. But I got up to the lake and I had that immediate like, okay, where do I go? Because I was just looking at it, and it's always so daunting for me personally when I get, and I say lake, this was a little pond. It was maybe 5 acres ish, not very big at all. But even then, I was like, oh, okay, where do I go? And there was so much chop on the water that I couldn't really see the different features that might have been in the water. So even though this is something that like I can tell you folks, like here's what to do and here's how to do it, it's something I still struggle with too. So definitely don't feel bad if lakes give you grief, because I think that they are tougher to fish than rivers, in my opinion. So anyways, back to the whole thing about water features and whatnot. The key with still water is that you've got to remember you can't lose sight of the fact that trout love structure, right? They want to be around something that gives them a little bit of cover. So you should look first when you get to a new still water is look for sunken logs, rocks, or even the transition from deep to shallow water. Breaks and weed beds are another type of great structure where you can put flies in. Points on the shore where the shore juts out into the water are great to look for too, because as trout are cruising around a lake looking for food, they're often going to do that following the shoreline. So the points on the shoreline are going to force all the trout to swim around them. acting almost like a choke point, if you want to think of it that way. It's a great place to set up shop and get a little bit of fishing done. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of like, okay, look for structure, figure it out. As for the flies, well, if the fish are rising, that should be pretty easy, right? You tie on a dry fly. But if they're not active on the surface, and the lake I was at yesterday, they weren't, because if there were any bugs out, they're blown off by that tornado or whatever it was I was in the middle of. But I've found that you're going to have the best luck with leeches, streamers, scuds, and chironomids. Those should be your go-to when you're in a lake environment. You can rig those under an indicator and suspend them near a structure, like between breaks in the weeds or right on that drop off from shallow to deep water. Trout like to be able to ambush in places like that, and those types of structure make them feel safe. They can come out, grab your fly, and zip back just like they do in a river, right? They might hang out from behind a rock, or they might hang out in an undercut bank or something. They zip out, grab the food, and go back. Okay, same concept generally that you're looking for on a lake. You can also cast into a deeper part of the lake and then retrieve your streamers back towards the shore. I do that most often during ice off situations or right before the ice is coming on. That's when the fish are, I've found, tend to be a little bit more aggressive and more willing to chase streamers. My preferred method, though, when I'm out, and this is what I did yesterday, is I stuck a leech and a chironomid under an indicator, and then I let that sit out in the water. I feel like I'm effective with that rig on still water because I can change the depth, I can change the flies out. I've got 2 flies on, so I'm kind of covering my bases a little bit. You can still strip flies in at that point, even if they're under an indicator. It'll just suspend them at a certain depth. So it's a pretty versatile rig, I've found. Again, with streamers, I do strip them at ice off because that's when I think they're most aggressive. It's a lot of fun. I honestly don't have a whole lot of luck stripping streamers on still water in the warmer parts of the year. So that's when I switch to that deeper rig with the nymphs under an indicator. But the bottom line, identify structure where fish are likely to congregate, whether that's a drop off, a sunken log, a rock, points on the shoreline, and focus on putting your flies there. Whether you put 2 nymphs under an indicator or strip a streamer, you're going to want to be doing any of that where it's most likely that fish are going to hang out. So hopefully that answers your question, Garrett. Thanks so much for writing on in. Clay from Michigan's got our next question, writes in and says, the other day I was fishing a local trout stream in West Michigan when I hooked the most abundant fish on the river, a log resting on the stream bed. I was using a 2-fly indicator rig with my bottom fly attached to be a tippet to the bend of the top hook. When I dislodged from the log, I found that I had lost my bottom fly, tippet and all. After examining my remaining fly, I found that the hook was slightly straightened, leading me to conclude that my knot slipped off the barbless hook. I'm wondering if you have ever had a similar experience. Does it make sense to run a barbed hook on the top fly and a barbless below? Lastly, is there a particular knot you suggest when attaching tippet to the bend of a hook? Love the podcast. Keep up the good work. Hey, Clay, thank you. And thanks for the questions. I like this question a lot. So, short answer, I've had a dropper slip off a barbless hook before. It's happened. That's the only downside to using barbless hooks. However, I can count on one hand how many times it's happened to me. I think the fear of that happening is outsized. I'm basing that on my own experience. There might be folks out there who disagree with me. In fact, I know there are, because I've seen this discussion argued before on Facebook groups or forums or wherever it is, where people say, never use barbless flies. You're always going to lose your dropper. And I'm like, well, literally, I can count on one hand. I've had more hooks. In fact, I tell you this, 100%. I've had more hooks break on me than I have had droppers slip off a barbless hook. 100%. So you take that for what it's worth. One thing, though, that I've personally noticed as I rig up my dry droppers is that on flies that come with a barb, I crimp my barb off with my hemostats, and that gets rid of almost the entire barb, but it leaves just a tiny lip that, in my experience, it doesn't impact how easy it is to take that fly out of a fish's mouth, but it does help that dropper stay just a bit more secure. So if you are really worried about it, then I'd recommend maybe just crimping the barb off of every fly that you use as your top fly and not buying barbless hooks or tying on barbless hooks if you tie your own flies. But personally, I don't fish any flies with barbs on them anymore at all. I either tie on a barbless hook, because I tie almost all of my flies, unless Alex or Berkeley tied them for me. But again, I either tie on barbless hooks or I crimp the barb off. We did an entire podcast on this topic, and I'll link that in the show notes for anyone who's interested. And this topic being barbless hooks, by the way. But the short of it is that it's so much better on the fish to use a barbless hook because it's easier to get a barbless hook out. That decreases the time that you spend handling the fish, and it decreases the injuries to fish that result from barbed hooks, like ripping off parts of their face. That sounds a little dramatic, but there was down on the Gray Reef and Miracle Mile sections of the North Platte here in Wyoming. There was a story in one of our Wyoming newspapers, Cowboy State Daily, their online news site, and they had a story, month and a half, 2 months ago, about guides on that section of the North Platte. Incredibly famous, Miracle Mile, Gray Reef section, world-renowned, incredible trout fishing. How the guys are noticing that so many fish down there have facial deformities. They've lost, I think it's called the mandible. I might be completely wrong on that, but they've lost the more flexible parts of their face where that can get easily damaged by hooks and flies, and it's leading those folks down there to consider going to barbless, right? Because the damage it can do to the fish, especially if you're newer to it and you're not practiced at getting hooks out of a fish, it can be a challenge. It can be a lot of freaking work, right? And I know, and I said this in our barbless hook podcast. I know that I've killed fish trying to take a barbed hook out of them before. I know that's happened, right? Just looking back on my fishing career, I know that's happened. It sucks, but it's happened. Okay, going to barbless, not a problem anymore. It's literally, I just go down, the hook pops out. Half the time the hook pops out in the net, right? Once the tension is off of that fly, those things come out like butter. It's amazing, okay? If you keep tension, let's talk about tension for a minute. We talked about it earlier. If you keep tension on the fish throughout the entire fight, those barbless hooks, they're not just going to slip out, right? That's a little myth that in my experience, I've never experienced that where the hook just slipped out even though I did everything else correctly, right? The hook has come out of fish before. Barbless hooks have come out because I haven't kept tension on the line. And if you don't keep tension on the line perfectly when you're fishing barbless hooks, the possibility of you losing those fish increases exponentially. But if you're doing it right, if you're fighting the fish correctly, if you've got tension on the line, you've got nothing to worry about, right? That's my 2 cents, but I believe it strongly, okay? I also know a couple of guides who they're convinced that they get a better hook set with barbless flies because there's nothing stopping that hook from sinking deeply into the fish. The barb might not help the fly slip back out, and that's just a theory. I don't know that it really matters that much for trout, but it doesn't help the hook travel as deeply into the fish. Okay, these guide friends of mine, they don't have any science to back up their claims, but they guide 200 days a year and only run barbless flies in their boats, so I'm inclined to believe them. And barbless flies are just way easier. This is the last point in their favor. They're way easier to pull out of yourself when you hook yourself, which I do a lot. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's going to happen. You're going to hook yourself at some point. All right. Soapbox over. Sorry. Sorry about that. I really would love to see the entire fly fishing industry go barbless. It's so much better for everybody and everything. It kind of blows my mind that we're not already there, especially on these really pressured tailwaters. It really surprises me that we haven't gone to barbless everything. So hopefully we can get there as a fly fishing community. I'm doing my part, and I encourage folks to do their own. This is not I'm better than you because I fish barbless hooks. It's not where it is at all, right? I fish the barbless hooks. I crimp the barbs down and everything, or I tie on barbless hooks if I can, because it's better for the fish. And the worry that we've had about losing fish because of that, it's outsized, right? So I definitely encourage everybody to give it a shot. There's nothing to fear about it. Keep tension on the line and you'll be fine. Okay, soapbox is really over this time. I promise. I didn't forget the rest of your question, Clay, because you did ask about the knot to attach tippet to the bend of the hook. I just use a regular old clinch knot. That's really all you need. It's my go-to. The clinch is my go-to for everything, so I don't have a reason to change it up. So if there's a knot, I know some folks really love the Davy knot. You could use that too. I just use the clinch. It's simple. It works. My knot failures, when they do fail, are almost always my fault, right? It's very rarely because I have a bad piece of tippet. But anyways, hopefully that answers your question, Clay. You got a little bit more than you probably bargained for from me there, but that's the risk you run from sending a question on into Untangled. But I appreciate you doing that anyways. And with that, folks, we have reached the end of yet another excellent podcast. At least I felt it was excellent. Hopefully y'all did as well. And if you do, if you think it was great, if you learned something from this, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you're listening to this show. The more ratings, the more subscriptions we have, the more visible the show is to a lot of different people, and the more anglers we can help have a great day on the water, which is our entire goal here at VFC and at Untangled. And if you ever have any questions you would like to have answered about the show, please don't hesitate to send those on in. There's always a link in the podcast description for you to do just that. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy summer, and tight lines, everybody.